Right, this is now the second part of the talk, and as I said at the end of the first part of the talk, I'm now going to talk about what is natural law, what is natural law theory. Again, I'm looking for about 20 minutes, so we don't bore you to death. But I really hope you stick with this and then take your studies further. It gives you the passion for being a lawyer. If nothing else, that's what I want to really get you youngsters, I say youngsters, but anybody listening to this, revive the passion. I mean, I had a senior judge say to me that once he retired, he wanted nothing more to do with the law. And I wrote back saying, to me, it's a passion. It's grown even worse now as I've stopped being a lawyer, because I'm not running the practice doing court cases and all the rest of the stuff. I'm now having time to think and see what's happening in the world and the laws that are being produced by our politicians that aren't, in my view, good. And therefore, that's got me started looking at the philosophy of law. And that's why I realise it's so important. And that's why I want you guys to at least take it on board. Incidentally, I just used the word guys there. I don't know if that's a word you can use anymore now. So apologies if it's not. It may not be. But again, that's all part of modern philosophy as well, terminology. And I'm not going to go down that road. I'll leave that to a linguist to explore that. And I should go back to what I'm discussing. So apologise if anybody didn't like that word. Right, natural law is linked to morality. So let's look at murder. Murder is obviously bad. So in simple terms, it's immoral. Morality is whether a natural law is something good or something bad or something right or something wrong. Murder is immoral. Another example, robbery. Robbery can be identified as bad in a descriptive sense. In a narrative sense, it tells you how you should practically behave. So in other words, you must not steal. It doesn't go into anything more than that. It sets out the conduct. So natural law makes morality part of the law and not outside it. So murder and robbery are immoral, and also good, also a good law, and also it is instructive as a matter of conduct. And of course, conduct need not be moral or immoral, but in this particular instance, the example I'm giving, it coincides. Those subjects are clearly immoral and illegal. So, when and under natural law is a law regarded as a law, if I can put it like that, it's when a rule complies with the standard of natural law. So does it have the values intrinsic in human nature, kindness, fairness, and morality? So where a law has those qualities, the best qualities, it is natural, it is law according to natural law. Right, so where did all this start then? Well, I told you to start with the ancient Greeks, ancient Egypt, but I'm going to start with the ancient Greeks. And I'm going to mention three that are very familiar to most people, which is Plato, Aristotle, and Socrates. And then, after discussing them, I shall move on to Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas, which is the medieval part and the Christian influence. And then I'll look at the natural law theory as more modern interpretations are placed on it by the writings of two chaps, a chap called Finnis and a chap called Fuller. Now, one thing about philosophy is that you cannot possibly read it without being told whose theory is whose. And so, in order to have a discussion about philosophy, it seems to be that philosophers regard each other as practically more important if you have more names to push about. But anyway, I'm giving you a few names. So, ancient Greece, medieval period, and the modern period of natural law. So, the ancient city of Athens was run by male citizens, and they made up the jury. The rules were made up by the people, not women, of course, male juries. Plato was a heavy influence on Aristotle. So basically, Socrates taught Plato, Plato taught Aristotle. Now, Aristotle and Plato believed that there was a moral obligation to follow the law. So basically, it was just the public made the rules. There were good rules because it was by consent, had human qualities to it, and therefore you don't need judges, you don't need lawyers, because everybody will follow it because it's good stuff to do. It was the effect of the death of Socrates, Plato's teacher, which expanded his thinking. And it's worth talking about Socrates because Socrates believed in that system too. And Socrates was charged with an offence, which was not accepting the gods, which obviously is quite serious, and corrupting the youth, but I don't think in a sexual sense. Now, he could have escaped that, but he believed in the system and the rules, and the jury made up of the citizens will be right because it's the right things, he's telling the truth, and they'd believe him. Sadly, he was convicted, and he's sentenced to death. Now, for those of you that slightly like the more macabre, you have to commit suicide, or you had to commit suicide yourself in those days if they're sentenced to death, and he was required to drink hemlock, and that was the end of him. So Plato then realized that this was a submission by Aristotle to an unjust and immoral law. Plato doesn't actually write his own stuff. He tends to record the debates by others. But I think it's right to say that he believed that city-states should be based on a benevolent dictatorship where people are trained from birth in terms of morality, politics, and philosophy, and all the good things you need to become a philosopher king. That means, because he was taught like that, that the reliance could be placed upon the sovereign, the philosopher king, and although tyranny was the worry, he believed that this reduced the threat of tyranny because the single leader was trained in all the qualities. So, contrast today, of course, where how behaviour is regulated, how leaders should behave, for example. So behaviour is regulated, and even how the leaders should behave, for example, is things that one should look at. The Constitution of the United States is a good example of that. That requires the Senate, the judiciary, and the president to behave in certain ways to prevent tyranny by one limb of government over the other. I'm going to come to that later, but you can see how it's not going very well in the United States at the moment, and by extension, it's not doing very well for the extended world order and the world of rules. And I'll discuss that as well. The other thinking behind this idea of a philosopher king, you didn't need to restrict him. And the law was less to be coercive, to force people to do stuff, because quite simply it was a matter of education, of virtue, in fact, it's a virtuous rules. So this was, the idea was to take individuals from say, what would have become the warrior class, and turned them to the philosopher king. Trump has often been referred to as the new king, but unfortunately for Trump, he lacks in the philosophy part of it, or the training of it. I'm saying that objectively speaking, because of course I know that's a matter of fact. He doesn't say he's ever been trained in those abilities. So, in ancient Greece, then, the city-states of Sparta and Athens took place. Plato was spending more time looking at the philosopher kings, but then Aristotle, his student, took a different view, and he looked more at human nature, and he referred to something called teleology. Now I'll spell that as Teleology, which refers to the importance of the end of the thing, what you're trying to achieve at the very end, and that determines whether something's moral or not. So whether it's a good law or not, whether it's law or not. And he believed that everything has an end. So if you plant a seed, I think this is the illustration I saw somewhere, it ends up being a plant. And humans have a reason, which at the end should result in social, political, and economical understanding. So he believed that government should be for the common good, and laws will be laws will be just and not unjust to avoid tyranny. Now, you've got to think about this. I think that was about 400 BC. I'm not 100% sure on my history, but so they were looking at good stuff in ancient Egypt, as ancient Greece, trying to make the human relationship of the people living in the state better, kinder, more moral. So that Aristotle thought that when human beings became political creatures, this would result in goodness. That's what he believed. I can't necessarily say I believe that, but that's what he believed. So he also said that the end result, things that helped a good result, was a good thing. So like watering plants to make the seed go into a plant was a good thing. So law helped mankind with good law in city-states. Aristotle spent 20 years studying at Plato's school of philosophy, or academy. When Plato died, Aristotle went off, and he ended up teaching Alexander the Great. So it shows the importance the world held, and his country held, and the countries in the area held, of this kind of thinker. We don't have that kind of debate nowadays. There's not this search to try and make things better in the true sense. In fact, we tend to spend more time criticizing. But anyway, then we have St. Thomas Aquinas. He took this a bit further by adding the influence of Catholic religious ideology. And so that leads quite nicely onto medieval and religious influences. This vested quite heavily in the St. Augustine of Hippo, Hippo, and St. Thomas Aquinas. Now let's be quite clear, St. Augustine came first, and he did not know about the teaching of Aristotle at the time that he did his writing. So he did not include Aristotle type ideas in his writing. St. Augustine believed in original sin, so you're born sinful and you had a need to repent. So he was a bit more like Plato in that sense. It was all about good and evil, submitting to a higher God and a philosopher king. Positive law, which is we're going to come to later on, is basically what law is. And he said we don't need positive law. in other words, just simply creating law by a lawmaker, because we submit to a higher authority. So it's natural when you have a standard of morality which is derived from a god or a king. Hope that makes sense. To set at this period, St. Thomas Aquinas lived between 1225 to 1274. Now, he did know about Aristotle. He basically thought that positive law, which is created by law, created by the state, and internal law were related, but he thought that positive law, the state-made law, played the role in social and political life rather than the acts of sin. So, good and evil, and the needs of the state. He did, however, and I think it's impossible to overlook it, it's got to be right, an overlap between law and morality, particularly in those days. So to understand law, we must talk about morality, natural law. We've got to talk about morality. All human law should be compared to natural law. And he believed that an unjust law only has an appearance of law. So an unjust law, a bad law, has an appearance of law, because in order to be the law, it's got to be just. So that was a qualifying ingredient. So not easy again, but put it basically, good law, God law came from the Bible, and natural law from human observation. Positive law, which is the law made by the state, is good. It's good if it comes upon divine and natural law together. Right. I'm going to look at modern natural law theory. I think I've still got a few minutes yet on my self-imposed time limit. We've looked at law and morality in terms of earlier beliefs, but of course things changed in the 40s. We had a world war. In World War II, the behaviour of the Nazis was enacted by their law, but their law was clearly cruel and immoral, but it was their law all the same. And the post-war trials at Nuremberg was in fact a return to imposing morality in the system. And next time I'm going to discuss procedural natural law by Lon Fuller and natural rights by John Finnis. So that's procedural natural law for Fuller and natural rights by Finnis. So basically this is a modern gloss on the ancient theories that we've just discussed, and largely brought about by the end of World War II and the Nuremberg trials. So next time we'll move on to number 3, lecture 3, and that's going to be procedural natural law and natural rights, 2 separate things.